What happens when a black doctor, who has spent his life saving others, becomes the target of a racially charged complaint? You won't believe how he turns the tables and exposes the system in a way no one saw coming. Julius Benson had long stopped believing in miracles. He was too smart for that. Miracles were for people who didn't understand that life was a battle, not a gift. He knew that everything given was eventually taken back, with interest. And right then, with his hands elbow deep in blood, Julius knew one thing. He was ready to save a life. He had saved people his entire career. But this one, this was different. This wasn't just a patient. This was a man who, perhaps, didn't even know that his life now depended on the very hands he despised. He didn't know that the hands saving him were those of a black doctor, hands that had heard the words, "You don't deserve this," more than once in his life. Words full of poison, words full of hatred. Yet here was Julius, doing what he was told to do, fulfilling his duty, because for him, saving a life always came first. If Julius had allowed himself even a moment to think about the man lying before him, he might have noticed something else, something that went beyond the physical wounds. The man before him wore more than just cuts and bruises. His body bore the marks of a society that had already decided his worth based on the color of his skin. But Julius didn't make excuses. He wasn't there to justify anything, not to anyone, least of all himself. He was a doctor. His job was to save lives, regardless of the person's history, their race, their beliefs. It was all that mattered. The man on the operating table was a symbol, not just of the violence that had brought him there, but of the much larger fight Julius had been waging for years, and he would continue to wage it, regardless of how heavy the world tried to make him feel. Julius knew that if he didn't keep his hands steady, if he let the weight of what had been said to him or about him crack his resolve, he'd lose everything. Not just his career, but his dignity, and that was one thing he'd never give up. As the operation continued, the room was thick with tension. The nurses, the other doctors, they stayed silent, avoiding his eyes. They didn't interfere. The instruments were passed over with barely a glance, their eyes deliberately avoiding the man who was doing the work. No one spoke. No one moved. It was as though they all understood. This wasn't just surgery. This was a statement, and no one wanted to make it their fight. But Julius felt it. He knew exactly what was at stake. This man was not just a patient. He was the embodiment of everything Julius had been told his entire life. That he didn't belong, that his existence was a series of accidents that should have never happened. When the operation was over, Julius didn't feel relief, as most surgeons would. He didn't feel the satisfaction of a job well done. Instead, there was this knot in his chest, a heaviness that settled deep. Yes, the man was alive. Yes, he had saved a life. But in this moment, Julius knew something deeper, something darker. This man, who he had just pulled from the brink of death, was not grateful. He wasn't thinking about the fact that his life had been spared. He was thinking about something else entirely. As the man woke up, Julius braced himself. The first words he spoke cut through the room like a blade. "Better if I had died," the man muttered, his eyes narrowing when he saw Julius. That sting, it didn't just hurt his pride. It was an assault on everything Julius had ever believed in. It was a moment that shook him. This wasn't just about surgery. This wasn't just about being a doctor. This was about race, about the core of what it meant to be black in a system that never truly believed you belonged. Julius didn't flinch. He didn't react. He couldn't. Not in front of this man. He had seen this before, had heard this before. It was the reality of a world that wanted him to fail, but not this time. Not now. He had seen too much, been through too much, to let it break him now. He simply walked away. There was no argument, no justification. He wasn't going to waste his energy on a man who had already decided he was inferior, even in the face of his own survival. Julius knew this was the way it was. For people like him, there would never be gratitude no matter how many lives they saved. He went to his office, the weight of the encounter pressing on him like a brick. He had to keep it together. He had to keep fighting. But then it hit him. He had been here before. This fight wasn't new. It wasn't just about this patient or this one hospital. It was the same battle he'd fought every day of his life. Every time someone doubted him. Every time someone looked at him and saw a color, not a person, not a professional. It wasn't just in the hospitals. It wasn't just in the streets. This battle was everywhere, and no matter how hard he tried, he would never be allowed to forget it. As he sat back in his chair, Julius couldn't help but ask himself why. Why did he have to fight every day just to prove that he was good enough? Why did he have to prove himself worthy of the same respect as anyone else? Why was his worth constantly questioned, no matter how much he accomplished? He had the degrees, the skills, the knowledge. He was damn good at what he did. But none of that mattered. It never did. That evening, as the weight of it all sat heavy on his chest, Julius received a call that would change everything. The patient, the one who had been saved by his hands, had filed a complaint. It wasn't about his professionalism or the success of the surgery. No, it was worse. He'd filed a complaint accusing Julius of being a racist, of refusing him care because of his skin color. "There's no way a black doctor could have saved me," the man had written in his report. Julius laughed bitterly as he read the complaint. The absurdity of it stung, but it wasn't new. It was the system at work. This wasn't about his skill or the fact that he had given everything to save a life. This was about someone clinging to their hatred, using it to try and tear him down. The same old game, the same tired narrative. But now it was personal. Julius wasn't just going to let this go. He wasn't going to let someone who owed him their life tarnish everything he had worked for. He wasn't going to back down. This wasn't about proving himself to anyone. This was about proving to the world that he was here to stay, no matter how much the system wanted to break him. The days that followed were filled with tension. Julius knew that this wasn't going to be an easy battle. The administration was already preparing to side with the patient. They had the power. They had the resources. And more importantly, they had the public image to protect. But Julius didn't care. He was done with playing the game. He was done with standing on the sidelines, hoping for change. It was time to make some noise. He gathered his evidence, every piece of documentation he could get his hands on, every report that showed his competence, his dedication, his commitment to his patients. He was ready to go to war. But as he prepared for what was sure to be a difficult fight, he realized something else. This wasn't just about the hospital or about the complaint. This was bigger than that. This was about the kind of world they lived in, a world that refused to see him for who he really was, a world that had always tried to put him in a box, to keep him in his place. But Julius wasn't going to stay in that box, not anymore. He was going to fight, not just for himself, but for every black doctor, every black person who had ever been told they weren't good enough. He wasn't just going to save lives. He was going to make sure his life mattered too. Everything was about to change, and Julius was ready. What happened next will change everything. Stay tuned for the next chapter, where Julius takes on the system head-on and puts the powers that be in their place. You won't want to miss it. A few days passed, and Julius Benson felt the ground slipping beneath him. The patient's complaint wasn't just shocking, it set off a chain reaction that turned him into little more than a pawn in someone else's game. The man whose life he had saved was now the living proof that racism was not something of the past, but a living, breathing force that still ruled the world. And now Julius stood at a crossroads. He could either succumb to the realization that this battle had no end, that he'd been doomed to fight a never-ending war, or he could take this fight to a new arena, one far more dangerous. Benson wasn't broken, but his reaction was far from what anyone had expected. Instead of shrinking back into the shadows or retreating into self-defense, he accepted the challenge. From the moment the complaint was filed, Julius could feel the pressure building. His colleagues began to look at him with disdain. He could sense the division in the hospital. Some quietly supported him, while others, with barely hidden smirks, began scheming on how to make his fall easier for themselves. And so, the moment came when Julius realized he could no longer keep fighting windmills. He had to respond. He took the patient's complaint to a lawyer, gathered all the documentation and evidence he could to support his professionalism, but also to show how racism had poisoned his career. But just as he prepared to face the challenge head-on, a far more dangerous foe emerged, the head of the hospital himself, Mr. Charles Patterson. This wasn't just any superior. Patterson was the top of the food chain, the kind of man who saw people not as professionals, but as disposable commodities for his ambitions. Patterson, like many others, believed that people with skin like yours should be thankful they even had a chance to work in a prestigious hospital. If it weren't for a few high-profile cases that Julius had won in the past, he would have never even risen to the level of senior surgeon. But Patterson looked at him differently, and now, with a chance to finally put him in his place, he wasn't about to let it slip away. The first few meetings Julius had with Patterson were filled with that cold, racially charged resentment that Julius couldn't stomach. His boss didn't hide the fact that he saw his actions as borderline disrespectful and that problems like pushing through patients with ridiculous complaints should have been handled at a much lower level. But in Julius's eyes, there was fire. He realized this wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a coincidence. There was no escaping this battle, no matter how much he tried. He wasn't just a doctor in this system. He was a black doctor, and he was facing obstacles that his white colleagues would never understand. Then one day, in a hospital hallway during a break, Julius and Patterson came face to face. Patterson muttered something about not liking Julius's uninvited courage. "You understand, Benson," he said, wiping his hands of the same venom that his words carried. "You really don't understand how this world works. We're all here trying to be the best, not to be some damn hero." Julius gave him a smile. Thin, tight, the kind of smile that meant everything and nothing at the same time. But in his chest there was no hesitation. He was done holding his tongue. His thoughts raced. If this world didn't want to accept him, then he would make it impossible for them to ignore him. He wasn't just the man who saved a life. He was someone who had the power to change a whole generation of doctors like him. And if it meant he had to wade through the filth to do it, then so be it. But he wasn't staying quiet anymore. This had become personal. "You were saved," Julius thought, sitting in his office, staring at the patient's complaint, feeling the weight of the system pressing down on his shoulders once again. He couldn't believe someone could be so bitter, so full of hatred, that they couldn't even appreciate life being given back to them. He couldn't help but let out a bitter laugh. Saving a life, and oh no, someone's not happy about it. Maybe they all just want me to dance to the tune and jump through hoops for every damn test. As Julius began his meeting with his lawyer, the air in the room was thick with tension. He wasn't sure of the outcome. No matter how much he wanted to believe in justice, he knew that the courts and hospitals weren't the place for black people fighting for their rights. He had overheard whispers about minorities and how this could all turn against him. But still, he refused to stay silent. It couldn't continue like this. He never wanted to be just another black man who was put down while doing his job. Julius made a decision. He was going to use the most powerful weapon he had, the truth. The truth about how pushing patients was never part of his agenda, that his only choice was to save lives. The system could do what it wanted, but it couldn't keep ignoring reality. If the truth forced them to face the consequences, then maybe, just maybe, it would stop destroying people like him, who were simply trying to survive in this broken world. The moment of reckoning was close. The buildup of weeks, the dirty politics of the hospital, the cold stares from his colleagues, all of it had been leading to this point. This is the moment, everything you've been waiting for. Stay with me to see how Julius puts everyone in their place. As Julius sat across from his lawyer, the weight of the situation didn't escape him. He knew the path he was about to walk was far from easy, but he had made his peace with it. He had spent his entire life trying to prove his worth, fighting for a seat at the table that had never been meant for him. "I've been fighting this my entire life," he muttered under his breath, his fingers tapping on the table. "Not just for me, but for all of us, for every black doctor who's been told they weren't good enough." The lawyer glanced at him, sensing the intensity in his voice. "You're not alone in this fight," the lawyer said softly, almost as if trying to calm Julius's simmering resolve. Julius straightened his back, his eyes flashing with determination. "I know I'm not alone. I can't be. Not anymore." The day of the hearing came, and Julius stood at the front of the room, facing a board of administrators, medical directors, and a few colleagues who had been silently watching from the sidelines. The complaint was in front of them, accusations flying like daggers meant to wound him. But Julius wasn't flinching. He wasn't going to back down. "Let's be clear," Julius started, his voice steady but firm. "I am here because I saved a man's life. I didn't do it for a medal or a pat on the back. I did it because that's what I was trained to do. But it seems some people would rather let hate stand in the way of life. And I'm here to tell you, I won't let that happen anymore." The room went silent. It wasn't just a courtroom moment. It wasn't just a moment of rhetoric, it was a declaration. I am not the one in the wrong here. You want to label me, to put me in a box and dismiss me like I'm not good enough? I won't let you. I'm good enough. I've always been good enough. And you're going to see that today. The silence that followed was palpable, but it wasn't fear that filled the air. It was respect. Respect for the man who stood in front of them, not as a doctor, not as a black man, but as a human being who had simply had enough. Julius didn't need their approval. He didn't need their validation. But in that room, as he stood tall, he knew one thing. This fight wasn't just for him. It was for everyone who had been told they weren't enough, for everyone who had been silenced for too long. He had won. The rest was just the fallout. And now the world would finally hear the truth. 3 days had passed since the complaint was filed, and Julius Benson felt like the ground was slipping beneath him. This wasn't just some office drama. No, this was real. This was the fight for his career, for his dignity, for everything he had worked for, every late-night shift, every overlooked accomplishment. The complaint wasn't just about a single mistake or a misunderstanding. It was the spark that had ignited a firestorm, a fire that was consuming him, but he wasn't going to let it burn him down. Julius knew that now, more than ever, he was at the center of the storm, and everything that had happened before, every ounce of injustice, had led him to this moment. The hospital administration, as expected, was already scrambling to protect its reputation. Instead of addressing the real issues, they were doing what they always did, passing the buck. The truth didn't matter to them. What mattered was image. So they threw him under the bus, hoping that, by making an example of Julius, they could appease the higher-ups in the public. But this wasn't just a fight about a life saved. This wasn't about the man he had pulled from the brink of death. This was about a system that refused to recognize his worth. This was about a fight for equality, for justice, for the right to be treated like a person, not just a black man in a white coat. When the day finally came for the disciplinary hearing, Julius felt the weight of the world on his shoulders. His heart pounded in his chest, so loud it felt like it was beating in his throat. The room was cold, filled with doctors, lawyers, and other hospital representatives who had come to watch, to judge, but not to listen. Julius could sense it immediately. Their eyes weren't on him with any sense of respect. No, they were watching to see how they could distance themselves from the mess he was about to create, from the mess they had created. They weren't concerned with justice. They were concerned with survival. Julius knew the drill. He knew that if he stayed quiet, if he let them control the narrative, this would be just another case of a black man being thrown away. The complaint wasn't about his medical expertise. It was about the color of his skin. It was about everything that came with being black in this system, and he wasn't going to let that happen. He stood up. The room seemed to shrink. The air felt thick with tension. His colleagues stared at him with varying degrees of discomfort, disbelief, or indifference. But Julius knew this was his moment. If he stayed quiet, they would win. If he bowed his head, if he let them have their say, he'd lose everything he had fought for. "I'm not here to apologize," he said, his voice steady, his gaze unwavering as he scanned the room. "My job is to save lives. That's what I've been doing from the moment I first put on this coat, and that's what I'll keep doing. But if anyone here thinks that my skin should dictate whether I treat someone or not, then maybe you aren't cut out to be a doctor." There was a shift in the room. A few people exchanged glances. Some shuffled in their seats, but no one spoke up. They were all too afraid to confront the truth that Julius was now laying bare. He could feel the weight of their judgments. He knew some of them would never accept him, no matter how many lives he saved. Some were probably already counting the days until he was gone. "I didn't save that man's life for a thank you," he continued, his voice rising just enough to make his point hit hard. "I saved his life because that's my duty, but I will not sit here and let anyone tell me I don't belong, or that my colleagues and I are anything less than the professionals we are. You can call this emotions, but trust me, this is about principles." There it was. The room seemed to freeze for a moment. Everyone was waiting. No one expected Julius to speak this way. They didn't know what to do with someone who wasn't begging for approval, someone who wasn't apologizing for his existence. But Julius had had enough. He wasn't here to explain himself. He was here to take a stand. "I know what you're all thinking. You think we, black people, don't belong here, that we're not as smart, as capable, as qualified as anyone else. But let me tell you this, you're afraid of us. You're afraid of what happens when we rise, when we show you that we're just as good, if not better, than anyone else. And you hate it. You hate that you can't control us anymore. He could feel the tension in the room build. It was palpable, like a tightrope stretched too thin, waiting to snap. Some of the more cynical members of the board shifted uncomfortably. Julius's words hit their target, and they didn't know how to respond. His truth was like a bullet they hadn't expected. You want me to stay in my place, right? You want me to be the quiet, humble black man who knows his role, who accepts his position? Julius continued. Well, guess what? I'm not staying in that box. I'm not going anywhere. You want me to stay silent so you can all sleep at night in your white coats, pretending you don't see what's going on here? I'm not playing that game. Not anymore. His words rang out in the room, sharp and heavy. For a moment, it felt like everything stopped. No one moved. No one breathed. Julius had said what no one else would dare to say. He had called out the system for what it was, and now it couldn't hide. Patterson, as expected, wasn't about to let Julius have the last word. He stood up, his usual polished demeanor faltering just slightly. He began defending himself, talking about procedure, about how the complaint was just a misunderstanding, and how Julius was too emotional about the whole situation. But Julius didn't flinch. He didn't back down. Emotional, Julius scoffed, turning toward Patterson. You want to talk about emotions? You want to tell me I'm emotional? I'm emotional because I'm tired of seeing people like me pushed down, stomped on, ignored. I'm emotional because I'm sick of seeing people like you sit in your ivory towers, making decisions about lives you've never had to fight for. I'm emotional because I know I'm better than the system that's trying to break me. And if you can't handle that, then maybe you're the one who's out of place here. The silence was deafening. Patterson opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. The room was too stunned by what Julius had just said. He wasn't just confronting them, he was exposing the truth that no one wanted to acknowledge. At that moment, Julius knew something had changed. The battle wasn't just about him anymore, it was bigger than that. It was about all the black professionals who had been told they weren't good enough, all the people who had been silenced by systems that refused to let them rise. And then, just when it felt like he had hit the peak, Julius dropped the bomb that would seal his victory. I'm not asking for your apology, he said, his voice low but steady. If you want me to be who you want me to be, you're mistaken. I'll be who I am, and if you can't handle that, then it's on you. But I deserve to be here. I earned this spot. The silence in the room wasn't just the absence of noise. It was the sound of the walls closing in on the system that had tried to bury him. Patterson stood there, his mouth hanging open, not knowing how to respond. And Julius, he stood there unflinching, knowing he had won. It was over. Julius had done what so many others before him couldn't. He had taken the fight to them, and he had made them realize that the system had failed him, not the other way around. And in that moment he knew. He wasn't just a doctor, he was a warrior, and he was going to keep fighting.